reflection, and felt the familiar weight of being underestimated settle over her shoulders like a cloak she had worn her whole life. And instead of going to the holding office, she walked toward the war room, a place rookies entered only to observe, never to interrupt, guarded by protocols thicker than the blast doors themselves. But she had something now, something that changed the math, and that something fit on a small encrypted drive that she carried not in her pocket, but in her mind. Because the real thing wasn't the data, it was the question the data forced you to ask. When she reached the war room, the guards hesitated, recognized her badge but not her authority, and she asked calmly for 5 minutes, just 5, to present a systems integrity concern that affected fleet safety, and they laughed, then frowned, then called upstairs, because the phrase fleet safety has a way of slipping past pride and into fear. And moments later, the doors opened. Inside, the room buzzed with senior voices and projected maps, the accident already reduced to a bullet point on an agenda slide. And as Mara stepped forward, the base commander's jaw tightened, irritation flashing. But before he could speak, she said only, "Sir, with respect, if you assign blame without seeing this, you will ground the wrong people and leave the door open for it to happen again." And she placed nothing on the table, instead asking for the master clock feed, the unfiltered one, live, which caused a ripple because that feed was supposed to be pristine, unquestionable. And when it appeared on the main screen, she asked for a second feed from an independent sensor array, one the base rarely used because it was old and didn't make the metrics look good. And when the two clocks appeared side by side, the room fell quiet because they disagreed. Not by much, but enough. Enough to show that during the incident, the authority had shifted. Enough to show that someone had told the system a different time to tell the truth. And Mara spoke softly as she walked them through it, explaining how a human error would have left fingerprints everywhere, while this left them only where someone wanted them. Explaining how the patch authorization tied back to a readiness optimization pilot approved at a level far above hers. Explaining how the analytics module created a feedback loop that simulated stress to harvest performance data, a loop that no one had told operations about. And as she spoke, faces changed, not to anger, but to calculation, because they understood now that the rookie wasn't the problem, she was the witness. Questions came fast, sharper, and she answered without triumph, without accusation, because she knew the room was deciding not just what happened, but what would be allowed to be said. And then came the twist that even she hadn't fully anticipated, when a general asked why she hadn't reported this earlier, and she replied, "Sir, I tried, but my access was reduced the moment my name was attached to the incident, so I did the only thing left. I made it impossible to ignore." And that landed harder than any chart. The meeting recessed, calls were made, doors closed, and when it reconvened, the agenda slide was gone, replaced by a new directive suspending the pilot program and ordering a fleet-wide audit. And the base commander cleared his throat and said the words that would never make the press release. "Lieutenant Klein is cleared of responsibility." But what followed mattered more, because responsibility rolled uphill, quietly, into offices with thicker carpets and fewer windows, and the story could have ended there, with vindication. But life doesn't wrap itself so neatly, because the backlash came sideways. Anonymous complaints, stalled evaluations, the slow grind of an institution protecting itself. And for a moment, it seemed like truth had won the battle, but would lose the war, until the carrier group's after-action report cited Mara's findings and requested her by name for a systems integrity task force, a request that was hard to deny without questions no one wanted. And she transferred, stepping onto a larger stage where the stakes were higher and the shadows deeper, carrying with her the lesson that had been carved into her early, that systems fail in predictable ways, but power fails in human ones. Months later, when a similar accident tried to happen somewhere else, it didn't, because the clocks were watched now, the loops had been disclosed, the rookies listened to, and somewhere in a war room, a general paused before pointing a finger and asked a different question. And that, more than clearing her name, was the thing Mara had walked in with all along. Not a drive, not a chart, but the refusal to accept an easy lie. The insistence that accountability start with truth, even when truth is inconvenient. And if you're still here at the end of this story, remember that the next time a simple answer is offered too quickly, because behind every blamed rookie, there may be a war room waiting for the right question to walk through its doors. They blamed the rookie before the smoke even cleared, before the alarms finished echoing through the concrete veins of the base, before anyone bothered to ask how a first-week logistics officer could possibly cripple a multi-billion-dollar weapons system. And as the camera lights flickered on in the command hallway and the murmurs of accusation swelled like a storm, a quiet voice in your head should already be telling you to stay with this story and, if you value truth surfacing in a world that loves easy villains, hit subscribe right now because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that powerful people pray never gets told. The accident, if that's what it was, happened at 2:17, when a training launch turned into a cascading systems failure that shut down radar coverage across half the coast, grounded aircraft, and sent a carrier group scrambling blind for 17 terrifying minutes. And by sunrise, the base needed someone small enough to crush, someone new enough not to fight back, and that someone was Second Lieutenant Mara Klein, fresh from commissioning, still carrying the faint crease of academy shoes on her heels, her name mispronounced by half the officers who signed the preliminary report that stamped responsible in block letters beside it. And she stood there as they read it out loud, eyes forward, spine straight, absorbing the weight of a narrative being welded around her without her consent. A narrative that said she had skipped a checklist, misrouted a data packet, fat-fingered a command she barely understood. A narrative neat enough to calm Washington and fast enough to save careers. They reassigned her to temporary duty pending review, which in base language meant exile, windowless office, badge access reduced, whispers following her down corridors like she was radioactive. And yet beneath the uniform and the silence, something else was happening. Because Mara wasn't panicking. She wasn't scrambling to defend herself with emotion or excuses. She was remembering, replaying the night second by second with a precision that bordered on cruel, remembering the way the console clock lagged by exactly 40 milliseconds after a firmware update that no one had documented, remembering the checksum anomaly that blinked and vanished when she cross-verified a feed she technically wasn't authorized to touch, remembering how the system error presented like human error on purpose, and that remembering hardened into resolve. Days passed. The investigation committee formed, senior officers rehearsed statements about lessons learned, and the base commander gave a press-safe briefing about accountability, while Mara sat alone cataloging logs that had already been sanitized, comparing mirrored backups that didn't quite match, noticing that the timestamps drifted differently depending on which subsystem you queried, an impossible thing unless someone had altered the clock authority, and when she requested access to deeper archives she was denied, politely, repeatedly, until she stopped asking and started listening. Because bases have sounds. The hum of server rooms, the cadence of guard changes, the late-night footsteps of people who think they're alone. And one night, she followed those sounds to a maintenance annex where an old friend from training, now a civilian contractor, let slip that a patch had been rushed through under a special authorization hours before the accident. A patch that rerouted telemetry through a third-party analytics module designed to optimize readiness metrics. A harmless phrase that set off alarms in Mara's mind because readiness metrics were the one thing the upcoming budget review hinged on. She thanked him, returned to her desk, and began building something, quietly, patiently, assembling a timeline that didn't accuse but simply showed, correlating packet paths, clock skews, authorization keys, and human access points. A mosaic that suggested not a mistake, but a test, not a failure, but a probe. And as she built it, the pressure mounted elsewhere. Because Washington wanted closure, the carrier group wanted answers, and the base wanted its reputation restored. So the committee scheduled the final session, the one where they would formally assign blame and move on, and Mara was not invited to speak. The morning of the session she pressed her uniform, checked her reflection, and felt the familiar weight of